Hi. I'd like to share with you something that really spoke to me this morning from the life of Abraham. And this is from Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. And it's interesting because this is the first time that God calls Abram by name. So before he was called Abraham, he was called Abram. And this is the first time he uses his name. In chapter 15 of Genesis, verse 1, it says, "And after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not fear, Abram.'" This is the first time he uses his name. "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you, and your reward shall be very great." This whole idea of shall be, he says, your reward shall be very great. When God says shall or will, it is huge. It means it has to happen. If he says it shall happen, it shall happen. If he says it will happen, it will happen. He says your reward shall be not just great, but very great. Your reward will be very great, Abram. He says, I'm going to be a shield to you. I'll protect you. Do not fear. The same do not fear was said to both to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, to all three of them. All three of the patriarchs had some times of fear in their life. He said, I'm a shield to you. I'll protect you. And then he said, and your reward shall be very great. And then Abram expresses one of his fears. He says, and Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, since you have given me no offspring, one born in my house shall be heir. So one of his fears was that he had no offspring, and who's going to be his heir? But according to Hittite laws, which were in force at that time in that area, one of his servants, his oldest servant Eleazar of Damascus, not that Eleazar was a bad guy, but it wasn't his own offspring. So then God said, it says, then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man shall not be your heir, but one who comes forth from your own body shall be your heir. Someone who comes forth from your own body shall be your heir. There's the promise. He goes directly at one of the things that was frightening Abram. He says, one from your own body. There was no promise yet for Sarai, but for Abram there was a promise. And then it says in verse 5 of chapter 15 of Genesis, and he took him outside and he said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them. Count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. If you're able to count them, so see if you can. And so shall your descendants be. Count the stars if you're able. I got all the time in the world. Go ahead, try to start counting. The sky must have been just perfectly clear. And he's counting the stars and he just can't count them. And he says, so shall your descendants be. But it's interesting. It says in verse 5, and he took him outside and said, he took him outside. What does that mean? What do you mean he took him outside? Did that mean that God picked him up out of his tent and took him outside? Or does that mean that God took him by his hand? We don't know. But he took him outside. You see the personal relationship here. This is actually the first time we see a dialogue between Abram and God. In the past, it would say God said, God spoke. But here now Abram's speaking back and having a dialogue with him because God addressed him for the first time in this chapter by name. Previously, it would say God said to Abram such and such. But here it says that he said, do not fear, Abram. He spoke to him by name. And here he takes him outside. What does it mean to take him outside? I've pondered this. What does it mean to be taken outside? Say you have a family member. You've seen the Grand Canyon a dozen times. But now you're bringing in one whom you love to see the Grand Canyon. You're more excited about the way they see this than the way you see this yourself now. You just want to see the expression on their face. God wanted to see the expression on Abram's face. You see the closeness, the fellowship here between Abram and God. That God does this. And then it says, then he believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He believed the Lord, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, because he believed God. Because he believed God. There's an interesting passage in the New Testament that is something like this, and it talks about this very incident talks about this very incident. It says in Romans chapter 4, verse 17, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you. This is what he said to Abram. You're going to be a father of many nations. Every time it says nations, it means it's going to bring in the Gentiles. In the presence of him whom he believed, even God, who gave life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. So in Romans 4:17, it says God can give life to the dead and he calls into being something which does not exist. This is contra thermodynamics. But God can call into being something that does not exist. In hope against hope, he believed so that he might become a father of many nations, according to that which has been spoken. So shall your descendants be. Now he's going to be a father of many nations. Now Abram becomes our father. Abraham becomes a father. In fact, in verse 16 of that same chapter 4 of Romans, it says, for this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be in accordance with grace, so that the promise will have a guarantee to all the descendants, not only to those who are of the law, but to those who are of the faith of Abram, who is father of us all. And then it ends that chapter with this. But in verse 23, now, not for his sake only was it written, that it was credited to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be credited, as those who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. When we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it will be reckoned to us as righteousness. Because in verse 25, he who was delivered over because of our transgression was raised because of our justification. It says in verse 22, it was credited to him, to Abram, as righteousness, quoting from Genesis chapter 15. It is credited to us as righteousness when we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in Romans 10:9 it says that we must confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God raised him from the dead, and then you will be saved. That's what it says. You will be saved when you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He brings us right back to the resurrection. And this is credited to us as righteousness when we believe in the resurrection. If this has been a blessing to you, share, subscribe, or like, or thumbs up, whatever social media platform you're watching on. God bless.